They didn't notice at first, just a brief hesitation, a flicker in their eyes when they spoke. But now the silence that followed Rose everywhere was louder than any scream. The quiet town of Linden had become a cradle of nightmares. And as she stared into her husband's cold, unblinking eyes, she realized something horrible. Their promises weren't to be broken, only renewed. Her time was running out. Soon she would be one of them. Soon she would forget too. It started slowly, so slowly in fact that I almost didn't notice. A word misplaced here, a slight falter in conversation there. Jacob had always been absent-minded, so at first I chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, the past few years had taken their toll on all of us. But as I sat across from him that morning, watching him spread butter on his toast with the careful precision of a surgeon, something felt wrong. "Rose," he murmured, not meeting my eyes. "Have you felt it?" I frowned, taking a sip of my coffee. Felt what? Jacob's hand trembled, just slightly, and he set the butter knife down with a clink. "The air, it's heavy today." I glanced out the window. The sky was overcast, a blanket of thick fog rolling over the trees that bordered our town. Linden had always been a quiet place, too quiet if you asked me, but that day the silence seemed oppressive, almost tangible. Still, it was just a typical autumn morning, wasn't it? "I'm sure it's just the weather," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Jacob didn't respond. He stared at his toast, unmoving, as if he'd forgotten how to eat. By the time the second week rolled around, the whole town felt different. People who had once greeted me with polite smiles now barely acknowledged my presence. At the grocery store, Mrs. Lafferty, who had known me since I was a child, glanced at me with glassy eyes, her movements jerky as she scanned my items. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Lafferty?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Her hands stilled, and for a moment she looked at me as though I were a stranger. Then, just as quickly, her usual warm smile returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, fine, dear. Just fine. Been a bit distracted lately. You know how it is." I didn't know, but I nodded anyway, taking my groceries and heading for the door. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint but clear, just behind me. "They're watching." I spun around, but no one was there. Mrs. Lafferty had already turned away, busying herself with the next customer. The following days blurred together in a haze of confusion. I couldn't shake the sense that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just Jacob, it was everyone. They moved strangely, their words often trailing off into silence as if they forgot what they were saying. Conversations felt rehearsed, each phrase just slightly off, as if they were reciting lines from a script they no longer understood. At night, I heard whispers, Jacob mumbling in his sleep, phrases I couldn't make out. Once he muttered something that sent a chill down my spine. "They're waiting for us. Under the skin." I had no idea what he meant, but when I tried to wake him, he only turned away, eyes still closed. It wasn't until I ran into Dr. Vornoff at the town hall that the pieces started to fall into place. He was standing by the bulletin board, reviewing the latest updates on the town's vaccination progress. Linden had been one of the first to get the new vaccine, a special batch, he'd explained, designed for smaller, isolated communities. I hadn't given it much thought at the time. We'd all been so desperate to return to normalcy after the pandemic that it had seemed like a miracle. "Dr. Vornoff," I called, my voice echoing in the empty hall. He turned, his smile as cold and calculated as ever. "Mrs. Dempsey, how are you? Is everything all right with Jacob?" I hesitated, studying his face. There was something about the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl. "He's not himself." Dr. Vornoff raised an eyebrow. "That's not uncommon. Many people have experienced mild side effects, fatigue, disorientation. It should pass." But it hadn't passed, and I knew deep down that it wasn't a side effect. "It's more than that. He's been different. Everyone has." The doctor's smile didn't waver. "I assure you, Mrs. Dempsey, it's nothing to worry about." I wanted to believe him, but something about his calm demeanor unsettled me. His eyes never blinked, never strayed from mine, as if he were watching me too closely. "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for the reassurance." As I walked away, I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, lingering far longer than it should have. Jacob's condition worsened after that. He became forgetful, unable to recall things we had just talked about minutes earlier. Sometimes he would stare at me blankly as if trying to remember who I was. His mood swings grew violent. One moment he was calm and affectionate. The next, he was screaming at me, accusing me of things that didn't make sense. "You don't see them," he whispered one night, his voice raw with fear. "They're inside us, Rose. They're waiting." I reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched as if my hand had burned him. "Jacob, what are you talking about? Who's inside us?" His eyes darkened and he leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "The ones we forgot to fear." It wasn't until I stumbled upon an old journal in the town's library that I began to understand the magnitude of what was happening. The journal belonged to one of the town's founders, a man named Elias Harrington, who had written extensively about a secret society known as the Unseen. The pages detailed strange rituals, promises of eternal life, and whispered warnings about submission to the ones who watch from the shadows. Elias had mentioned a pact, a forgotten oath that the town had made generations ago. In exchange for longevity, the townspeople would become vessels for something else, something ancient. The words sent a shiver down my spine. They come in times of need. They live under the skin. And once the promise is renewed, they will take what is theirs. It all clicked together. The vaccine, the erratic behavior, the whispers. The vaccine wasn't just a cure, it was a method of control. It was how the Unseen would claim their vessels. Jacob was no longer just my husband. He had become something else, something waiting for the day it would be fully awakened. And as I looked around Linden, I realized that the entire town had been marked, their lives entwined with the ancient cult's dark promise. I confronted Dr. Vornoff, demanding answers, but all he gave me was a smile, a knowing, sinister smile. "You were chosen long before you knew, Rose. You too will forget." Desperation clawed at me as I raced through the town, trying to escape the inevitable, but no matter how far I ran, I couldn't outrun the truth. It was in the air, in the whispers of the people I once knew. My friends, my neighbors, they were gone, lost to the promise they had unknowingly made. One by one, they turned against me, their eyes dark and hollow. And in the quiet moments between their cryptic words, I could hear it, the faint sound of something stirring beneath their skin. Jacob was the last. He stood in our living room, staring at me with eyes that no longer recognized me. "It's time," he said softly. "You can't fight it, Rose. You'll forget, just like the rest of us." The last thing I remember is the feeling of cold metal against my skin. Dr. Vornoff's voice echoed in my ears as he administered the shot, his words laced with something ancient and terrible. "You see, Mrs. Dempsey, you were always part of the plan. The vaccine was never meant to protect, it was meant to prepare." And as the cold spread through my veins, I understood. I had become one of them. I too would forget. But in that final moment, before everything faded away, one thought remained. There was no escape. There was no cure. Only submission. The town of Linden stood quiet once more, shrouded in mist. From the outside, it seemed like any other town. But within its borders, something ancient stirred, waiting for the next cycle to begin. The forgotten oath had been fulfilled, and the promise had been renewed. And in the silence, they watched. I remember the night Lydia's laughter echoed through our dimly lit kitchen, a sound as comforting as the aroma of the simmering tomato sauce. Now her fragmented whispers haunt the empty spaces of our home, turning memories into nightmares. I sit on the edge of our bed, the moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting ghostly shadows that dance on the walls. Ethan lies asleep, his face serene, yet the words I can never forget spill from his lips. "They're coming for us, Daddy." I thought I'd made the right choice for my family, believing in a future where we would all be safe. But with every dose, I can feel the world around me closing in, the whispers growing louder. The truth lurks in the corners of my mind, clawing its way to the surface. I'm left with one question. What have I done? Life in Clifton was never dull, the vibrant city pulsing with energy. Each morning, I would navigate through a maze of honking cars and bustling pedestrians on my way to work. The skyline towered above, a testament to human achievement. My days were filled with code and caffeine, an existence shaped by routine. Lydia, my wife, was a devoted nurse, her compassion radiating through every patient interaction. We were the picture of a perfect family. Lydia's bright smile and Ethan's boundless energy filled our home with warmth. Yet, beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. It was during one of those ordinary mornings that the vaccination campaign launched, a beacon of hope in a time of chaos. We watched the news with mixed feelings, the promise of safety tinged with the fear of the unknown. "It's just a shot, James," Lydia reassured me, her eyes sparkling with optimism. "It's for our future." But in the pit of my stomach, a flicker of doubt ignited, whispering that perhaps this was the beginning of something dark. Weeks passed after our vaccinations, and the city buzzed with chatter about side effects. Conversations swirled around us like a storm. "I hear some people are having strange dreams," my colleague Mark shared over lunch, his brow furrowed with concern, "like they're being watched." I shrugged it off, attributing it to the anxieties of a world in flux. But Lydia began to change. Her laughter turned into soft murmurs, often speaking in disjointed phrases that made little sense. I watched helplessly as she spoke of people who weren't there, her voice taking on an eerie, melodic tone. "They tell me things, James. They say I need to listen." Ethan's transformation was equally unsettling. Our son had always been afraid of the dark, a fear I once found endearing. Now he would lie in bed, eyes wide open, whispering phrases that chilled my blood. "They come in the night." My heart raced as I paced the floor, a sense of dread coiling tighter around me. Fueled by a growing paranoia, I began to research the vaccine. As I dug deeper into online forums and scientific studies, a web of unsettling connections emerged. Whispers of a secret experiment swirled around Dr. Adrian Costas, a prominent neuroscientist whose work in auditory technology was rumored to be intertwined with the vaccination rollout. I spent sleepless nights in front of my computer, searching for anything that would explain the changes in my family. It felt like I was staring into an abyss. Each article led to another, each link darker than the last. Reports of patients exhibiting strange behavior, doctors silenced by a web of deceit, and hidden studies detailing the potential of subliminal messaging played in my mind like a terrifying loop. My obsession grew as I realized that the vaccine may have been a vehicle for something far more sinister. I had to confront Dr. Costas, but as I pieced together the puzzle, a gnawing realization settled in. I was not only fighting for my family's sanity, but also for my own. As days turned into weeks, Lydia became a mere shadow of herself. I would wake to find her standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, her lips moving as if engaged in a conversation with unseen entities. "James, they need me to understand," she would say, her eyes clouded, as if something beyond our realm had taken root within her. Ethan, once vibrant and full of life, withdrew further into the dark corners of our home. The cryptic phrases grew more chilling. "They'll take you next," he whispered one night, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. My heart raced as I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation creeping in, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. The whispers echoed louder now, crawling beneath my skin, gnawing at my sanity. I found myself pacing the house at night, seeking answers in the darkness. The walls began to close in, each shadow twisting into grotesque shapes that flickered just out of sight. In a desperate attempt to save my family, I arranged a meeting with Dr. Costas, a man known for his brilliant mind yet enigmatic demeanor. His office, tucked away in a sterile high-rise, felt more like a mausoleum than a place of healing. The air was thick with tension as I confronted him, my voice trembling with urgency. "Why are they changing? What did you do?" I demanded, my words laced with fear. He looked at me, his eyes glinting with a disconcerting calm. "The mind is a fragile construct, James. We're merely exploring its limits. The vaccine opens pathways. It's a breakthrough." His dismissive tone ignited a fury within me. "You're playing God with people's lives." But his laughter echoed back at me, a chilling reminder that I was a mere pawn in his twisted game. "You're too late to turn back, James. The process has begun." Returning home, I felt the weight of impending doom pressing down on me. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the shadows whispering secrets I could barely comprehend. I found Lydia in the living room, her eyes wide and unseeing, muttering phrases that sent shivers down my spine. "They're calling me, James. They want me to join." I could feel my sanity slipping as Ethan's voice echoed through the hall, a guttural whisper that wrapped around me like a vice. "Daddy, you have to listen to them. They know everything." As night fell, the atmosphere shifted, thickening with dread. I crept into Ethan's room, heart racing. He lay still, and as I leaned closer, he turned towards me, his eyes wide, reflecting a terror I had never seen before. "Daddy, they're here." Suddenly, the room filled with a cacophony of voices, a chorus of whispers that transcended language, clawing at the edges of my mind. I staggered back, the walls shaking as I realized I was not alone. Desperate for answers, I returned to Dr. Costas's office, my mind racing with dread. The world outside faded into a blur, and as I confronted him again, I felt a shift in the air. "You have to stop this. You don't understand the consequences." But he merely smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "The mind is a canvas, James. You've given it color. Now it must be filled." With a sinking feeling, I realized that he had been manipulating not just the vaccine, but our very realities. He was the puppeteer, pulling the strings of fate, and I was losing control. Returning home, I felt the walls closing in as Lydia and Ethan's voices merged into one haunting melody. "You should have listened, James," they whispered in unison, their eyes glazed over as if they had become vessels for something dark and ancient. As I staggered back, the room spun, shadows swallowing me whole. "No, this isn't real," I screamed, but the whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, enveloping me in a suffocating embrace. The last thing I remember was the overwhelming sense of despair as I succumbed to the darkness, a world of whispers consuming me, erasing my very essence. Now I wander through the shadows of my mind, trapped in a limbo of fragmented memories and whispers. I watch as the world unfolds outside, people oblivious to the horrors lurking within. They'll never understand what lies beyond the veil of sanity. And as the echoes of Lydia and Ethan fade into silence, I know that I am lost forever, a mere whisper among the shadows, waiting for someone to listen. I stood before the classroom, my heart pounding like a war drum. The laughter of my students faded into an echo, swallowed by the heavy silence that had crept into Clearwater Middle School since the day of the mass vaccination drive. It was a typical Tuesday morning, yet it felt like the calm before a storm. The bright autumn sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the desks, and in those shadows I sensed something lurking. I glanced at Emily, my best friend and colleague, who was preparing her lesson in the back corner. Her eyes, usually filled with warmth and mischief, were now clouded, distant. "Nate," she said, her voice low and quivering, "do you ever feel like we're not alone anymore?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken truth. I had thought it was just stress from the school year, but deep down, a primal fear gnawed at me. Something was wrong, so terribly wrong, and soon I would discover just how much darkness had seeped into our lives, reshaping our reality in ways I could never have imagined. Clearwater was a quaint little town, nestled between rolling hills and whispering forests. I had lived here my entire life, watching it grow and change, but never had I felt such an unsettling shift in the air. The vaccination drive had been presented as a necessary step for the health of our community, a way to protect our children and safeguard our futures. But as the days passed, the people around me seemed to change in ways that defied logic. It started with my students. At first it was subtle. A vacant stare during lessons, a whisper of confusion when I called on them to answer questions. "Anyone? Can anyone tell me about the causes of the American Civil War?" I asked one morning, scanning the classroom. Silence met me, the kind that wraps around you like a shroud. Emily, seated at the back, raised her hand hesitantly. It was, Her voice trailed off as her eyes glazed over. "Nate, what if we were never meant to know?" The unease in my chest tightened. "Know what, Emily?" She shook her head slowly, as if the question itself had exhausted her. "I don't know. Just, maybe it's better this way. Days turned into weeks, and the odd behaviors spread like wildfire. Teachers began talking in riddles. Parents avoided eye contact, their expressions distant, as if they were staring through a veil. My own colleagues started calling in sick more often, citing headaches or fatigue. The school became a ghost of its former self, haunted by whispers and shadows. But it was Emily's transformation that terrified me most. One evening, I found her at our favorite diner, the comforting smell of coffee and pancakes failing to soothe my fraying nerves. As I sat across from her, I felt a chill run down my spine. Her fingers drummed nervously on the table, and she stared at the salt shaker like it held the answers to questions neither of us had yet to ask. "Nate," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "do you ever see things that aren't there?" I frowned, unease prickling my skin. "What do you mean?" "Like visions, futures that aren't real." My heart raced. "Emily, what are you talking about?" She leaned closer, her voice trembling. "I can see it, Nate. A desolate world, filled with ash and despair. It's coming for us. It's already here." Panic surged through me. "You're just tired. We've been working too hard." "No," she snapped, startling me. "You don't understand. We're losing ourselves." I spent countless nights researching the vaccination and its effects, piecing together a puzzle that felt increasingly insurmountable. The town's website was flooded with posts promoting the vaccine's benefits, while the local newspaper dismissed any concerns as mere conspiracy theories. "Why can't anyone see what's happening?" I muttered to myself one night, scrolling through endless forums. "It's like we're under a spell." The more I dug, the more I stumbled upon whispers of an experimental nanotechnology that had been integrated into the vaccine. They were designed to manipulate perception and thought, but nobody wanted to believe it. Desperation clawed at me. I had to confront Emily about her strange behavior, to dig deeper into what was happening to her. But the next day, as I arrived at school, I found the hallways eerily quiet, students shuffling about with blank expressions, as if they were mere shadows of who they once were. In the following days, the situation worsened. Emily's riddles turned into ramblings, and I watched helplessly as her mind fractured under the weight of her visions. "It's all connected, Nate. The vaccine, the shadows, the whispers. We have to escape before it's too late." But there was nowhere to run. I had tried reaching out to the school board, only to be met with dismissive stares and polite nods that felt like daggers in my heart. "It's just stress," they assured me. "Everyone is adjusting." But it wasn't just stress. It was something far more sinister. I began experiencing hallucinations myself, shadows that darted just out of sight, whispers that followed me down the hall. One night I woke to a cold sweat, the sound of laughter echoing in my mind, the laughter of children warped and distorted. I stumbled into the living room, only to find my television flickering with static. And then, amidst the chaos of sound, a face emerged, its features twisted and grotesque, its mouth moving in a silent scream. It was clear I couldn't do this alone. I reached out to Jake, a childhood friend who had recently returned to Clearwater. He was a journalist, known for his investigations into shady dealings in small towns. I needed his help to uncover the truth about the vaccine and what was really happening to our community. "Jake, people are losing their minds," I pleaded over coffee at the diner. "It's like we're all under a spell." He frowned, skepticism lining his features. "You really think it's the vaccine? It could be a mass psychogenic illness." I shook my head. "No, this is different. It's more than just anxiety or stress." After a few weeks of digging, Jake unearthed evidence of an underground lab tied to the vaccine's development. They were conducting experiments on unsuspecting populations. Us. "This isn't just a vaccine, Nate. It's an experiment." But just as we were starting to connect the dots, the darkness in Clearwater deepened. The townspeople began disappearing, swallowed by the silence that had overtaken our lives. Emily was next. In the days that followed, I became a shell of my former self, a mere shadow drifting through the haunted hallways of the school. Emily's absence left a gaping hole in my heart, a painful reminder of what I stood to lose. I combed through her house, searching for clues, for any sign of where she had gone. The living room was cluttered with papers, drawings of twisted landscapes filled with ash and sorrow. In the middle of it all lay a small notebook. Flipping through the pages, I found frantic notes about a hidden truth, a connection between the vaccine and an ancient force that fed on fear and despair. "This isn't just about us," I murmured to myself. "It's about something far worse." Driven by desperation, I returned to the school, hoping to confront Dr. Voss and demand answers. As I stepped inside, a chill settled over me. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I found him in the lab, a sterile environment filled with high-tech equipment and glass vials, his expression cold and calculating. "Ah, Natalie," he said, his voice smooth like honey, yet laced with something sinister. "What brings you here?" "Where is Emily?" I demanded, rage bubbling within me. "What did you do to her?" Dr. Voss regarded me with a dispassionate gaze. "She chose to undergo the procedure voluntarily. We all have our roles to play." "Voluntarily? You're manipulating everyone's minds. This is inhumane." He chuckled, a low, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. "What you perceive as manipulation is merely evolution, Natalie. The human mind is a canvas, and we are the artists." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as his words sunk in. He was insane, blinded by the allure of power. But before I could turn to leave, the room around me twisted. Shadows danced on the walls, morphing into grotesque figures that whispered my name. "Join us, Natalie," they hissed. "Become part of the new order." I fought against the pull, the urge to succumb to the darkness that enveloped me. Just as I thought I'd break free, I heard a familiar voice. Emily's. "Nate, help me!" "Emily!" I shouted, fear fueling my determination. I had to find her. I sprinted out of the lab, the world warping around me, the whispers growing louder. Days turned into a blur as I navigated through clear water, battling the illusions that threatened to consume me. The whispers led me to the woods behind the school, a place where shadows intertwined with the trees, casting eerie shapes across the ground. "Emily!" I called, desperation echoing in the stillness. The woods felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that sent chills racing down my spine. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing. A macabre sight awaited me, the remnants of a makeshift lab, surrounded by twisted branches and charred earth, bore witness to the horrors that had unfolded. And at its center, there was Emily, her form barely recognizable, bound to a tree, eyes wide with terror. "Nate," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I can't. It won't let me go." I rushed to her side, but as I reached for her, the shadows erupted, a mass of darkness swirling around us. "You shouldn't have come here, Natalie," a voice boomed, deep and resonant. Dr. Voss emerged from the shadows, a sinister grin on his face. "You've meddled with forces beyond your comprehension. This is the price of knowledge." I glanced at Emily, her eyes pleading. The darkness loomed closer, suffocating us with its presence. "We can't let him win, Emily," I shouted. "Fight it." As I struggled against the shadows, I felt a surge of strength, a connection between Emily and me, forged in friendship and shared despair. "Together!" we cried, and the darkness recoiled, shrieking in fury. In that moment, the truth shattered like glass. The whispers turned into screams, the shadows writhing as we pushed against the force that threatened to consume us. But the darkness fought back with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated. Visions of despair flooded my mind, futures filled with hopelessness and dread. "This is your destiny," the voice taunted. "You can't escape." But I refused to accept that fate. "No, we are more than this," I screamed, holding on to the light within me. The connection with Emily became a lifeline, anchoring us against the tide of despair. As the darkness writhed around us, I made a choice. "We will not be your puppets," I shouted, drawing strength from our bond. In that moment of defiance, the shadows surged forward, threatening to swallow us whole. In the chaos, I felt a sudden jolt, as if the very fabric of reality had torn apart. I gasped as the shadows recoiled, their grip weakening. With one final push, Emily and I broke free, a blinding light engulfing us, illuminating the darkness. When the light faded, we found ourselves lying on the forest floor, the remnants of the lab scattered around us. The shadows had retreated, leaving only echoes of their terror. But as I looked around, The reality of what we'd experienced hit me like a wave. The town was forever changed, its people lost in their own nightmares, trapped in a reality reshaped by fear. I clutched Emily's hand, tears streaming down my face as the weight of our victory settled in. In the days that followed, the truth spread like wildfire. Whispers of the vaccine's dark side emerged, and the town began to awaken from its slumber. Yet for Emily and me, the battle was far from over. The connection to that darkness still lingered, a haunting reminder of what we had faced. We became advocates for the truth, determined to expose the horrors that had unfolded in Clearwater. But as we stepped into the light, a nagging doubt haunted me. Would the darkness ever truly be vanquished, or would it remain, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again? And as I stood before the classroom once more, the laughter of my students fading into an echo, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The silent echo would forever haunt us, a reminder that in the depths of despair, the darkness always awaits. As I close the door behind me, a chilling thought lingers in my mind. What if the real horror was not just in the shadows or the whispers, but in the minds of those we once trusted? The echoes of our past are silent, but they scream for attention, begging to be heard. And as I step into the unknown, I can't help but wonder, will we ever truly be free from the silent echo that binds us? Thank you for joining us in the depths of fear today. Your courage to explore the unknown keeps our nightmares alive. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next descent into darkness. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, fear is always lurking just beneath the surface.